Well, so pleased to be back with National Immigration Forum and leading the way, and especially to be back with two very good friends, Dr. Russell Moore and Cherie Harder. We won't spend too much time on introductions, particularly because I believe folks here know Cherie and Dr. Moore really well, but Cherie serves as president of the Trinity Forum, and prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, Cherie served in the White House as special assistant to the president and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush. Earlier in Cherie's career, she served as policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, advising the leader on domestic social issues and serving as liaison and outreach director to outreach groups. She has served in roles at National Endowment for the Humanities and has served in numerous congressional offices and served as deputy policy director at Empower America. Cherie is someone who believes that we can have a principled public space and that citizens can actually be informed so long as they're tapping into the deep and rich resources that our history offers us. And I've just so appreciated Cherie's leadership over the years, as well as her friendship. Dr. Russell Moore is president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. The ERLC is the moral and public policy entity of the nation's largest Protestant denomination. The Wall Street Journal has called Moore vigorous, cheerful, and fiercely articulate, and he was named in 2017 to Political Magazine's list of top 50 influence makers in Washington, and he's been profiled by the Washington Post, the New Yorker. His latest book is The Courage to Stand, which I have on my nightstand, and he's written numerous other books. The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home was named Christianity Today's 2019 Book of the Year. And he wrote Onward, which is a fantastic book, engaging the culture without losing the gospel. Dr. Moore is just one of the shining lights in Christian public life and in our public life generally today. And so, friends, so happy to have you here. We're reprising our conversation from last year, which is a rarity. I mean, I'll be honest, for me, usually I don't get invited back places. And so this is nice. Cherie, let me start with you. It's, as you think back to our conversation last year, and in light of how this, we won't talk about the election for the whole time. I do think, it's helpful to set some context. How do you think the election, the presidential campaign has influenced the possibilities for civility in public discourse? Do you find yourself more optimistic or less optimistic having this conversation today than you were last year?
Yeah. Wow. Elections are usually not great things for promoting civil discourse in the country. And I think it's fair to say that this election was, that was particularly true of this election. It was, a particularly nasty one. And one of the ways I think that probably pertains quite a bit to the whole immigration debate is something we talked about last year as well. Just the use of language to not just express, deep disagreements in policy, which are inevitable, but there was a lot of language that actually seemed to aim at promoting views of worthlessness of other people, even dehumanizing language, talk about infestations and invasions and referring to other countries, excuse my language, as shitholes and the like, language that basically encouraged the demeaning of other people, even the denying of their full humanity or dignity. And that's the kind of thing that utterly distorts our politics, but it also distorts our character. Because language not only reflects and communicates and expresses what we think, it also shapes what we think. And so when we repeatedly use the kind of language that encourages the diminishment and the dehumanization of other people, it distorts our own thinking, and it certainly distorts and corrupts the civic process and political process. So the thing I'm probably the most optimistic about is I think there hopefully is a critical mass of people, the ones that you don't hear from all the time on Twitter, but who are increasingly tired of the heat without light, the mudslinging that has simply made it difficult to see what is true and has tarnished our political process, and perhaps are eager for a new start. And people hopefully from both parties who feel that way.
Dr. Moore, what's your read on the current situation?
Well, I remember being a kid in evangelical America and just noticing how every 4 years people would say, this is the most important election of our lifetimes, or the most important election since 1860 or what have you. And I remember thinking, well, that can't be true every 4 years unless we're just constantly ratcheting things up. Now, I think what's changed is that there's that sense of apocalyptic. Everything is an existential threat, but it moves very quickly. It used to be that people would still say, various places on the religious and political spectrum, this is a threat to our entire existence, and then it would take them a while to see, no, we can continue to go forward. Now it seems that we just bounce back and forth from these little apocalypses from week to week, sometimes from day to day. And I agree with Cherie that the exhaustion that's happening with all of this, it could lead to, in two different ways, frankly. It could lead to just a normalization of this kind of behavior where we just expect to theatrically pretend to hate each other, even if we don't. Or it could lead to people saying, we're tired, let's find a different way. And I'm hoping it's the latter.
Yeah.
Just to double click on something Russell has said there, one of the real challenges that we've seen, I think, in the last several years is even as our politics is getting increasingly apocalyptic, as Russell just talked about, our identities have grown more political.
Right.
And you see that just reflected in all sorts of different indicators. Apparently, it used to be that one of the most important factors in choosing a mate was a shared faith. Now it's a shared political party or shared political persuasion that has eclipsed one's faith as the most important factor in choosing a mate, or even in what parents would most want for their child. Our tribes are increasingly political. So as our identities become more political and our politics becomes more apocalyptic, this is a dangerous kind of trend. And one hopes that there will be an exhaustion for that. But part of, I think, any kind of recovery necessarily involves a recovery of identity outside the political. In relationships and commitments that transcend the merely political.
Yeah. I want to pick up on this idea of this barrage, this constant sort of string of little apocalypses. I'm not familiar with the plural of apocalypse, so forgive me. That seems to me to be constantly used to justify sort of departures from civility, in the sense that, like, yeah, that is the norm we'd want to hold to, but in order to meet sort of the test of our time, we really can't sort of concede that. We really can't hold to civility. But Cherie, in your opening comment, you made an interesting point about the fact that the way we speak to one another affects our hearts, affects who we are. And so, Dr. Moore, would love to hear you first sort of speak to this idea that civility is not just a set of procedures that we go through, but is actually about how we view ourselves and how we view others, and maybe even, I would wonder if there is any biblical context to an idea like that.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the word civility. I'll use it, but I have a higher bar, and that's the biblical idea of kindness as a fruit of the Spirit that I think we should exhibit. But if civility is all we can get, that's
if they bring us back for a third year, we'll finally use all that buy-in.
But the reason for that is because I think that civility can mean, in its worst iteration, just a kind of polite way of destroying one another. So I grew up in a Southern context where there is a certain kind of politeness that can also be cutthroat. And there was someone who came into my religious tradition from the outside and who said, at least when I was in this dog-eat-dog secular world, people would just say, I can't stand you. He said, but I feel like I don't ever know just because of the way people word things. And so that can't be what we're doing. Instead, we have to be actively kind to one another. And what that's going to require, yes, that has everything to do with shaping oneself. I mean, it just is not, it's not healthy to the soul for someone to have, as the Bible puts it, an unhealthy craving for controversy and a sense of quarrelsomeness. There's this sense of hypervigilance that in any animal or organism, as well as in human beings, if there's a sense of constantly being on guard, you can't then create or build because you're in a state of emergency. And it seems to me that's what we're all in right now.
I would just add to that one of the things we have seen, increasing over the past several years is with the proliferation of apocalypses. There has been, as you've said, Michael, an increasing willingness, even eagerness to kind of throw out the guardrails and constraints, toss aside the norms that once governed and constrained, awful behavior as necessary for the moment. And if one did not engage in that kind of behavior, that somehow reflected a lack of commitment, a lack of discernment of the importance of the hour, that somehow refusing to engage in an ugly way was itself a character flaw, that you just simply didn't understand what the times called for. And, it's not just a religious idea, but there's so much pointing to the fact that is so profoundly counterproductive. It is unhealthy to the soul. It is unhealthy to the civic health of a nation as well. So we've seen the rise of essentially the language of contempt, not merely anger, but the expression, again, I think I mentioned earlier, the worthlessness of somebody else, just their valuelessness. We have used the language of slavery about who owns whom. We've talked about triggering the libs or the right wing, which and using that is almost like relishing inflicting distress. And what all that does, of course, is one, it has a big impact on us, the users of that language, but it also makes it almost impossible to actually negotiate in good faith. How do you negotiate in good faith if you've just been called, a cockroach or the equivalent? It becomes very difficult to actually understand what the other arguments are. It basically turns any legitimate policy dispute, and all important matters of policies, there's going to be differences of judgment, there's going to be legitimate disputes, but it basically plunges every dispute into a food fight where it becomes almost impossible to think clearly, rationally, or calmly, because in a way, your identity has just been insulted.
Exactly. And it also prevents you from being able to prioritize what is urgent and what is not. Because if to be part of one's tribe, one has to pretend to be outraged constantly at the same level, then you really can't even figure out what's just tribal posturing and what is a real emergency where we need to come together and to deal with it. And it just leads to numbness.
Yeah. So let me just push this a little bit. Let's say if you've watched our politics sort of unfold over the last couple of decades and come to the conclusion that incivility works. We're here at an event. This isn't a civility conference. There are issues that people here care about. There are issues that I know each of you care about. And so a lot of the pushback I hear on civility or kindness, or basically leaving any political tool in the toolbox that could potentially be helpful in a practical way, is that by doing so, you don't really care about the issues you claim to care about. You must be willing to not see sort of the policy change that you want to see if you're not willing to do sort of quote unquote everything necessary to pursue it. Like, where's the flaw in that logic? How would you argue with someone who views civility as a obstacle to practical change?
Well, I think one can just look at our public life over the last 20 years and look at all that's been accomplished. The interstate highway system, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the GI Bill. No, those things did not happen in this context. They happened in a post-World War II context where there was dissent. Civil norms, these do not mean that there's not dissent. There needed to be a civil rights movement, for instance, saying Jim Crow is morally wrong. But why was it able to succeed? It was able to succeed because the civil rights movement said, first of all, we're speaking to our opponents as moral human beings, not as acting morally, but as those who are morally accountable. Right. And we're speaking to you, and we're speaking more importantly to your children and your grandchildren, that there can be another way, imaginatively. And the country, even just on these relatively benign things as building an infrastructure in the country, they were able to do it. I would argue incivility doesn't work unless what you're going to end up with is an autocracy with the most uncivil person always in charge of everything. But that's not our system. And so in order to have long-term gains, you have to be able to bring along at least some of the people with you.
You know, what I would add to that is the assumption behind what you said, Michael, is that persuasion is not possible. Mm-hmm. That the only way to triumph is by essentially destroying your opponents, and you can't persuade them. In many of the sort of the great debates of our country's history, there have been huge things at stake. And one of the things that has been so remarkable is the people who were the biggest change agents often made the most concerted and sustained attempt to persuade. So you look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. In a way, this was an incredible masterpiece. He did not pull punches. He pointed his finger at the moderate white clergy of the South and basically said, here is what you have enabled. But he did it in a way that at least left the door open to them being able to hear him. He didn't name call. He quoted or drew from Augustine and Aquinas and Niebuhr and Bunyan and the Bible to make his case. He basically appealed to common authorities and common reference points to say, open your eyes, look and see. Even when our country was founded, the first thing they did is when they declared their independence, they said that a decent respect for the opinions of mankind impels us to lay out the reasons. To the people that they are rebelling against, they basically did their best to lay out an argument about why they were doing so, why it was important, and why there was no other course. All of those are efforts to lay out a case, to persuade, to be heard, which are very different from name calling, character assassination, the mudslinging we've seen. Once one engages in any kind of ad hominem attack, the chances of actual listening, learning, and persuasion are reduced to basically nil.
Yeah. What does it look like? Now, I'm going to ask this in sort of two parts. I think just generally, what would it look like for our political leaders to contribute to sort of detoxifying our political environment? And then I'm going to ask you about like the rest of us, those listening in on this conversation, the average citizen, leaders who are leading. But first, sort of what is the role of political leaders, those who hold elected office, in detoxifying our political discourse?
Michael, I spent a number of years on Capitol Hill. One of the things that was a real lesson to me as a 20-something staffer was the extent to which different offices tended to take on the character of their member, of their leader. And so offices where the senator or the congressman or woman was affable, cheerful, collaborative, tended to be, for the most part, affable, cheerful, collaborative offices. On the other hand, I remember being so shocked as a staffer in the Senate with someone telling me that he worked for the senator will go nameless. He's still there, but at one point he got frustrated and punched a hole in his computer, and that was seen as funny in the office. In the office I worked at, that would be immediate termination. But the leader really did set the norms. And, Capitol Hill kind of shows that in kind of a microcosm because you have 535 offices there. I think it was Madison who talked about the better angels of our nature. Leaders can call us to the better angels of our nature, or they can validate, deepen, and even institutionalize our worst instincts. And I think that's one of the responsibilities that a leader has, is not only to try to enter into and do their work with wisdom and good judgment, working for the common good, but also to model that. I'm going to absolutely mangle this quote by Václav Havel, but when he took time after becoming president of Czechoslovakia, he took a summer to reflect. And one of the things he wrote is the only way to pursue justice and decency, and a sense of humanity in politics is to do so justly, decently, and humanely. The means have to point to the end.
Yeah. Dr. Moore, anything to add?
No, that's exactly right. And the sense of the actions of leaders in whatever realm of society, that flows downstream for generations. And so part of what has to happen is a long-term view that one is not just speaking to whatever constituency one's appealing to, and one's not even only speaking to one's opponents that one's seeking to persuade. You're also speaking to those who are overhearing you, who may be 9 years old right now, or 20 years old right now, but it changes their understanding of the possible. There was a politician in my home state by the name of William Winter, who was one of the first really public political figures in Mississippi to be for integration and for civil rights, and would stand up and talk about this in public audiences. And you can hear people who were kids at the time saying, I just never knew that was possible. that someone could have these views until I heard him. Didn't have any immediate effect, but it did 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later.
Yeah. And then just the follow-up, and I'll start this one with, I think the average citizen, not to, those who are pastors or those who maybe are civic leaders in their local community, they can feel daunted by what seems like sort of the titans of incivility that are out there. But then, of course, that feeling is, I think, even more profound for the average citizen. Is there a role for the rest of us to play in incentivizing or kindness or disincentivizing, incivility? And what might that look like?
Which one of us are you asking?
To you, Dr. Moore.
Okay. Well, I think the Apostle Paul said in the first century, be careful that when you bite one another, that you do not devour one another. And I think that in whatever realm of responsibility, there used to be a saying that people would have for sort of gimmicks in church growth movements to say, what it takes to get people there is what it's going to take to keep people there. Well, that's not really true, because it takes a lot more. It takes continuing. If you get them in with fads and gimmicks, you have to keep upping your fads and gimmicks to compete with other fads and gimmicks. The same thing is true in terms of this kind of perpetual outrage. If that is what you're appealing to, you're going to have to be permanently in that mode and amping it up and up and up. To the point that, as Jesus says, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And I think we can all see that in our lives of people who played to a sense of anger and resentment. And that does work. You can make a post viral if you're teaching people how to hate someone else, but it's ultimately self-defeating. Nuclear weaponry works. In terms of winning a war. But if that's a routine way of doing foreign policy, you're not going to have a planet for very long.
Yeah. I'd just add a few points. One is, even though leaders have great ability to either call forth better angels or call forth the worst in us, I think ordinary citizens actually have a lot of influence as well. Most members of Congress have very finely tuned political antenna and know where pressure points are. And if that kind of, the stoking of fear and loathing doesn't work and isn't rewarded by their constituency, they will stop doing it very quickly. One realm that I think affects probably most of us is, the world of the online. And, social media can be such a cesspool, and it can sort of trick one into what used to be called mean world syndrome, like the sense that actually it is a much angrier, more polarized, more unjust world than it actually is. Apparently lies travel much quicker than truth on social media, largely because the lies usually are dishonesties that feed our own confirmation bias, that basically tell us what we want to hear, even though it's inaccurate. So simply to sort of stop contributing to that, if one does, to take a step back, to actually, go to, to credible media as your source, to fact check things before passing them along, to essentially be a conscientious objector in the ever ongoing Twitter war. And if our political battles are often remarkably trivial, Twitter wars just takes that to a new level of the absolutely apocalyptic over the utterly trivial. You just simply stop contributing to that is a big step. And I think just one other point is probably almost anyone watching this is a leader or someone of influence in different spheres or sectors, whether it's their neighborhood, their family, their community, their church. and have real influence over what other people think. It's been said that the possible or the actual proves the possible, and to simply model another way in your own life can actually be a spur to the imagination to many others to be like, oh, yeah, I can do that too, because I've seen how it's done.
I think the last question I have, and Cherie, you spoke to this in your opening comments. Immigration has not proven to be like the most, immigration has proven to be a fertile ground for great acts of incivility. And I would just love for both of you to speak to whether there's a potential for the ongoing conversation, debate that many of those watching this will take part in, whether there's a potential for this issue to actually show possibilities for kindness and consideration and civility, or not. But would love your thoughts on that. I'll start with you, Cherie.
Sure. Well, I will not pretend to be an immigration policy expert at all. Of course, there's possibilities for that kind of conversation, and there has to be, because it's an extremely important issue and will be with us for some time. I mentioned before, the actual proves the possible. There have been agreements in the past. It is possible. It has been done before. It can be done again. I think probably most people in the immigration policy space, and many people watching will know this far better than I, there are certain areas where there is consensus. Across the spectrum, there is probably agreement that borders are important and need to be protected, that immigration has made this country what it is, and is, at least in certain ways and to certain extents, a good, that a nation like America has a responsibility to take in and to care for people who are persecuted and homeless. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, borders should be protected. And so within those different poles of consensus, there's going to be tensions and there's going to be disputes about how are those worked out? Where do we basically find policies that reflects those different principles in tension in a way that is good for the country and its citizens? And there's going to be different ideas about that. But the hope, of course, is those kind of discussions can take place in the context of looking for justice, for flourishing, for the civic good, knowing that there are going to be goods in tension. And any kind of a positive resolution to that, we'll need to keep kind of hearkening back to first principles, as opposed to either the mudslinging or the denying of the full humanity and dignity of some of those involved. That will be, that's just pouring battery acid on any kind of forward progress.
Yeah, I just spoke to someone in a small organization that was upended by a moon landing denier, which I didn't even know was still around. But the person said, we're having to devote so much energy to this, even though out of 100 people, 99 believe that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. The problem is they don't organize their lives around that. The one moon landing denier really cares about it, and everything is getting right back to that. And I think that's some of the problem that we have on the immigration front. Cherie is right. If you sit down with Americans, every public survey shows this, every just conversation shows this. Most people are for border security. Most people are for a robust American sense of immigration. The problem is there are people who really, really care about the issue, and they are the ones who invest their voices to the point that it exhausts everybody else. So we need that middle group of people to care about this as much as those on the extremes. That's the only way we're going to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. Always enjoy the opportunity to listen and learn to both of you. And thanks to the National Immigration Forum for hosting us once again. Thanks, Cherie. Thanks, Dr. Moore.
Great to be with you.